Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out. It's a heartening group to see on issues related to the UN Day, and humanitarian and global poverty issues. So that's a very encouraging sight for me. I think I can speak for Jan on that one, too. I want to just, while we're waiting for the more chairs to come, so those of you that are sitting uncomfortably on the floor, we hope to remedy that situation in a few minutes. But before we do that, I don't want to take time away from Jan, so I thought I would start with our usual list of thank yous for those that make this programming possible, particularly the Rotary Club of downtown Milwaukee, and in particular the A.D. Robertson Fund for the United Nations at downtown Rotary, as I speak, whose support has really made Jan's visit possible and is long underwritten. It's been a great partnership for the Institute to work with them on UN-related issues. I also want to thank the Wisconsin Governor's Commission on the United Nations, the Wisconsin Division of the United Nations Association, also two very active organizations that, if you don't know, you should know. Especially, I think people are free to be members of the UN Association. Isn't that right, Gary? They can. People are free to become members of the UN Association. You're still taking members, I think.
We are taking members, and we'd like a student alliance to start here at UWM, Marquette, Ernest Ridge, every place else.
So you can see Gary if you want to be a member, or come talk to the Institute if you want to work on reviving the student chapter. Also want to thank our corporate underwriters, the Brady Corporation and U.S. Bank. Milwaukee Public Television, Channel 36, which airs International Focus. Jan will be on an upcoming episode of that. Also, Milwaukee Public Radio, WWM. Jan taped an interview with Lake Effect, which I think, depending on how much election news there is in the next 2 days, hopefully we'll be able to squeeze in the next day or two. Also, Wisconsin Public Radio, WHAD. Jan will be on the Kathleen Dunn Show tomorrow at 10. So you'll have another chance to call in and ask questions then. I want to also put a plug in for another great membership organization, which is the Institute of World Affairs here at UWM, which is also the main source of our funds to make programs like this possible as well. So again, we invite you to become a member. We only take the most upstanding, intelligent, moral people. So I'm sure you will. If you're not that, you will become so if you join the Institute. Also, this part of our fall programming this year, we've done something which we haven't done in the past. Instead of trying to manage the craziness of pulling together an election-related foreign policy event with the two campaigns, what we did was we went using technology. We've gotten around that. So we talked to the McCain campaign and the Obama campaign to respond to a list of questions which we generated through a 1-hour call-in show on Wisconsin Public Radio on the Ben Marin show. So we developed a list of questions from that. We sent them off to the two campaigns. We've gotten a response from the Obama campaign. We are still trying to get a response from the McCain campaign. But the Obama responses are up on our globalcommons.org website. So we invite you to go to that. There's also a way to participate in a discussion, to comments and post things on that website as well. So you can keep the discussion going. You can weigh in on some of these important foreign policy issues on globalcommons.org. Tonight, those of you who may be familiar with our format, we have both the ability to ask questions from the audience. There's not a microphone. We're in a room, the acoustics carry enough if you speak loudly and clearly. So you can speak, you can ask a question from the floor, or there are also question cards which should be on your chairs, although for the ones that have just been set up, I'm not sure there were ones on those chairs. But if you want to submit a written question, you have the ability to do that. Also on the program, following the presentation by Jan, there'll be a book signing. There are books in the back of the room. You can purchase, or if you have your own, Jan will be happy to sign those. So, once again, thank you for coming, and it's now my pleasure to introduce Jan Egeland. That wasn't my introduction, though. You're a popular guy. I take that as an indication to make my introduction as brief as I possibly can. So, Jan, those of you know Jan know why he was put in Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential and called the world's conscience. He spent time most recently as the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and leading the Office of the Coordinator of Humanitarian Affairs for the UN, and was on the spot in natural disasters like the tsunami and the Asian earthquake, also in war zones in Darfur and Congo and in other places. He served as the Secretary General's envoy to the civil war in Colombia, where he played a very active mediatory role between the armed groups and just the Pastrana administration, correct, at that point. He also spent time in working for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway as State Secretary, and during his tenure, the Oslo process, the Norwegian channel which led to the Oslo agreements, were under Jan's watch. And many of you may not know that there were 7 other such processes that the Norwegian Foreign Ministry sponsored in places like Guatemala and Georgia, with the Georgians and the Ossetians. And he is a person who is not afraid to speak truth to power. I think he's not one to be shy about telling the international community they need to do more in places like Darfur and places like Congo. And that is a voice we've seen too little of since Jan left the UN, and are looking forward to hearing more of that. I want to say personally that I've had the pleasure of knowing Jan since I was a law student, and he was a researcher at an institute run by the International Committee of the Red Cross, and that was 22 years ago, when Jan was 10 and I was 4. We were very precocious for our ages. And I've been fortunate enough to cross paths with him in various conflict zones in the world. And it's no accident that he would be involved in some of the pressing, most needy situations in the world, and with some of the most needy, most endangered populations in the world. And for that, I think he really deserves our endearing thanks and a warm welcome for Jan Egeland.
Thank you very much, Rob. Thanks for those warm words. Welcome. Thanks to all here coming. Indeed, my professional counterparts for several years have been mostly dictators, warlords, guerrilla leaders, mass murderers. So it's good to come here and meet very nice people like you who applaud and who smile. The warlords didn't like me, I didn't like them, and I will now explain why. I wrote a book called A Billion Lives, summing up my experience having visited 110 countries over these last 30 years, working with the United Nations, the Red Cross, Amnesty International, and the Norwegian government. And I think the one thing that spurred doing the book was the many goodbye interviews that I did in New York in the UN building as I was leaving the job as the Global Emergency Relief Coordinator. Because the one question they all asked me, I remember vividly, whether it was the CNN or the BBC or Al Jazeera or any of the international networks, it was, are you now leaving this job depressed, or are you very depressed, having seen the world as it is? My answer was, I must not have been able to express myself as I should have, because I leave this job an optimist in spite of all. And let me explain why. Well, over these last 15 years, when I have been intensively traveling the world on behalf of the UN and other organizations, I've seen more progress than in any previous period, possibly in recent history. When the Berlin Wall fell and signaling the end of the Cold War in 1989, there were 65 wars in the world. 65 wars and armed conflicts. Today, there are 32. So there's 50% more peace and less war now than only half a generation ago. In 1980, which is 28 years ago, 52% of the world's population lived on under the $1.25 a day, which is the level of the absolute abject poverty where you can not really survive. Today, it's 26% in a growing world population. So virtually every year since 1980, 1% has been lifted out from this lower level, from that bottom billion level. When the Cold War ended, and even in the early 1990s, there were on average 10 unfolding genocides in the world. Today, according to the research group doing the annual Human Security Report, there is one, Darfur. There was, in the beginning of the 1990s, when I was responsible for international refugee works on behalf of the Norwegian government, 20 million refugees. Now there's around 10 million refugees. At that time, 20 million children died every year from preventable disease and malnutrition. Now it's 10 million. So there is progress. I remember, let me give one final indicator. When I flew as an 18-year-old, just out of high school, from Norway to cheapest ticket possible to Canada, came with the Greyhound bus to Chicago, bought my with 3 friends second-hand station wagon in Chicago, and drove it from Chicago through the U.S., Mexico, Central America to Panama, and went on myself to Colombia in the 1970s. There were between 15 and 25 military coups every year in the world, and there were military dictatorships in nearly every Central American country. Today, nearly all of them have functioning democracies. So I just wanted to start by saying, in these days of financial meltdown and tension in so many places, that to the fundamental question of each and every generation like our own, is the world getting better or is the world getting worse? We can say that for a number of years, it has actually gotten better for a clear majority of us. So it makes a lot of sense to work in international solidarity and compassion, because you can do a lot of good. And the United Nations, which we are honoring through this United Nations Day event, the United Nations have been part of very many of these achievements. There is peace today in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Ivory Coast, in Angola, in southern Sudan, in at least most provinces of the Congo, in northern Uganda, in Nepal, in East Timor, in Cambodia, and in the Balkans, for many reasons, but one common denominator is that the United Nations is involved in each and every of them. Together with the regional organization, together with the neighbors, together with the donors. But always the United Nations was there. It was necessary with a UN effort. Of course, there is a flip side to all of this. There is the other side to it, and that is that tonight, and that's why I called my book A Billion Lives. Tonight, 1 billion people will go to bed hungry. Tonight, 1 billion people who have lived through another day without clean drinking water. And tomorrow, 1.4 billion people will have to try to survive on less than $1.25 a day. And that is a shame, really, since the top 3 billion has had such a phenomenal growth. And all of those of us who now live on more than $100 a day, how come we have not been able to lift up the bottom billion, 1.4 billion, who live on less than $1 a day? Herein lies the great challenge of our generation. I hope some of you can watch the screen, because I wanted now to spend the next 25 minutes going through some 10 lessons that I learned in my 30 years of international work, and having seen all of these contemporary wars, disasters, but also success stories, and try to sum them up in 10 lessons. And I wanted to start with the first lesson, and that is we need to be prepared for the unexpected, because the world is changing for better and for worse more rapidly than ever before. And I wanted to start with the image that met me on all of the television screens of Newark Airport, who had CNN breaking news on as I landed in New York to take up my job as Emergency Relief Coordinator and Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. And it is the image of the UN building that was bombed that day in Baghdad, Iraq, the 19th of August 2003. And before I have been able to get out of the airport, the news has gone from the UN being bombed to Sergio Vieira de Mello, who was my predecessor in the job that I am to take over, is killed in Baghdad, heading up the UN operation there. We lost 22 colleagues, 100 were wounded. It was the worst attack against the UN since our foundation in 1945, and we were completely unprepared for it. Kofi Annan was assembling us to meeting those very first days. This is one in Geneva, where we are announcing that we're trying to cling on with a minimum staff to the benefit of the Iraqi civilian population. I'm sent there on my first mission to Baghdad, to the ruins of the UN headquarters, to discuss with colleagues there whether we can stay on with our good programs for the civilian population. Just before I arrive, a second bomb goes off outside of the UN building, and just after I leave, the International Red Cross is bombed, and it signals a new horrific challenge against international work and international public servants, that we've become targets for a new kind of international terrorism, and we were not prepared for this situation of there not being any middle ground anymore, we being targets for such violence. Now, so my second lesson is we have to understand that Wisconsin and Norway and the likes are pretty unrepresentative for challenges that a great deal of communities in the world are facing. And I experienced that when I was then an 18, 19-year-old traveling to Colombia, working with a Catholic relief organization, and here staying with an Indian tribe in the jungle called the Motilones. They were people, the oldest were in their 20s, because only 10 years earlier they have had the first contact with so-called civilization which brought with them common cold, which was a bacillus they didn't know, and which killed all of the grown-ups. These poor Motilone people survived through their children, wonderful people, full of hospitality. Remember, they asked me, we really got to be friends. They asked me, was I having a lot of headaches? No, I said. Why? Because it must be very painful to look at the world in blue. Your eyes cannot be good and normal. So the Motilones, when I came back 20 years later as a UN envoy for Kofi Annan, helping to see whether the peace process could succeed, that Indian tribe had, as so many others, been scattered all over because it fell, as the civilian population does, in the crossfire in Colombia between two guerrilla movements, the army and the paramilitary forces, and both the army and both the paramilitaries and the guerrilla wanted to take the jungle to produce cocaine, poppies, narcotics. The man in the light blue shirt, the man in the dark blue shirt is the good guy, that's me. The man in the light blue shirt is Manuel Marulanda, head of the largest guerrilla movement in the Western world. Colombia is, as it has been for the last 44 years, the center of the biggest war, the biggest human rights problem, the biggest drug problem, the biggest humanitarian problem, the biggest refugee problem in the Western Hemisphere. And it's one of the great paradoxes of our time and age that nobody really speaks about. It is within your and our hemisphere. It has more than 2 million people displaced, as many as Darfur. And it's going on decade after decade. Still, there is no peace with this guerrilla movement. Both men from the guerrilla side here was killed in the course of this year and last year. A new generation has taken over, and there were new fighting I saw yesterday in Colombia. Now, if we are to end these remaining 32 conflicts, we have to set ourselves ambitious goals. That's the third lesson. Set yourself ambitious goals. And that's what we tried, as illustrated by this image, in the Norwegian channel between Israel and the PLO in 1992, 1993, when we organized 14 rounds of secret negotiations in the Oslo area between Israel and the PLO. Those two enemies had never before discussed, negotiated face-to-face. At that time, Arafat and the PLO was seen as much as an untouchable terrorist group by Israel and the United States as Hamas is today. It took a secret channel for them to agree to recognize each other and to agree to the Oslo Accord, which was really a 5-year schedule for how to deal with those unsettled issues that are producing and perpetuating this conflict that is causing so much pain on both sides, continuously since the State of Israel was created in 1948. There were moments where we thought we would succeed. I have here a photo of happier days in 1995 when Arafat had come back to Gaza, and there was a building boom in Gaza because the Palestinians in the diaspora, including here in the United States, sent back all of their savings to build a second home and an industry and do an investment in the Palestinian areas because everybody believed it would be peace in the end. Israel and the Palestinians built industrial parks at their common borders where Palestinians could work and Israelis could increase their production capacity. It was the enemies on both sides that with great precision and great violence undermined a peace process, and today both sides are worse off. There is less security for both sides, and both sides should learn from this. There is only a return to negotiations that is possible to avoid them digging further down in a vicious cycle. Now, Middle East is a good example of the principle that I tried always to live through when I was in the United Nations, but also in other organizations, and that is always speak the truth as you see it. And I did that, for example, here in Beirut in the summer of 2006. On the 24th of July, the war had been going on for around 10 days between Hezbollah, which was sending a rain of missiles into northern Israel, and the Israelis who had invaded southern Lebanon with ground forces and were bombing heavily all over southern Lebanon at the time. I was, together with some UN colleagues, flown in the early Sunday morning by a British military helicopter that had permission to break the military blockade that all of Lebanon was under by the Israeli Defense Forces. When we came to Lebanon, at Beirut, we could see that the southern areas were being heavily bombed as we entered. We then, through the UN person that my office had in Beirut, in Jerusalem, got word that there would be a 3-hour break in the bombing and we could go down to see for ourselves in southern Beirut. I came there and I saw more devastation than I've seen in perhaps anywhere outside of Grozny, Chechnya, and Vukovar, Croatia. It's not often that in our generation you see large parts of cities leveled virtually to the ground. And it happened here. These are Shia Muslim areas of southern Lebanon. So I said there, as I was instructed to, the truth as I saw it. This I said, was bombing in violation of international law. These were civilian targets, primarily. Tens of thousands of civilians had lived here and they had fled. But I didn't only say that Israel was breaking international law. Of course, I also said that Hezbollah was engaged in a terror campaign, raining missiles into northern Israel, and they were, as I said, cowardly blending into the civilian population. For me, it was a jackpot of problems in the sense that both Israel and the Arab side boycotted my next meetings because both of them claimed that they were only victims in this war, and it was only the other side that were aggressively driving it, and it was wrong. But the point was that we managed to build an enormous pressure on either side We broke this spiral of violence that had gotten completely out of control. 2 weeks later, the war ended, and 1.2 million people who had fled could return. A UN force came in. Hezbollah stopped their missiles. Israel withdrew, and there has been a ceasefire since. Now, this was international cooperation, multilateralism, working well. And I like, just with this image of the outgoing US president, to say that, one of my basic lessons that I learned is that this is a time when we need to avoid unilateral action and where we need multilateral cooperation. Well, the US with UK going alone in Iraq and the consequences of that is well known. But let me then give one example of where the Bush administration actually succeeded in doing in spearheading multilateral action, and that's Liberia. In 2003, the same year as on faulty intelligence, one went to war in Iraq, the US did something very different in the Liberia case. It said to the Security Council, we need a UN operation that is good, robust, well-funded. And 17,000 UN soldiers were sent. They were taking over from and working with Nigeria and other neighboring countries in West Africa. And what was a cruel civil war. You may remember how Charles Taylor was administrating child soldiers killing each other in Liberia at a massive scale. Massacres every day. Horrific situation. I was there myself. In over 3 years, it went from hopeless war to development, democracy, a wonderful female democratically elected president, Ellen Sirleaf Jones. So how much did it cost? Well, for the US, 26% or $1 billion, which was the annual expense for that operation, which was successful. $260 million is a lot of money, but it is only 10 hours of expenses this year and last year and the year before for the US alone in Iraq. 10 hours. In an operation with a debatable outcome still. It was, the US has been as at most effective, in my view, when it has led in the UN, which it has often successfully done, and we need the US to lead in the United Nations. Another example is the tsunami. And my sixth lesson is really, there is no limit to what this generation can do when we work together. In the tsunami here in Aceh and in 10 other countries, the devastation was total, and it was the morning of the second day of Christmas. I was woken up at 6 a.m. with the news of it. Within days, we had organized one of the biggest humanitarian operations of all times. 90 countries became donors. 35 militaries, including the US military, provided effective humanitarian relief. Nobody died from lack of assistance, lack of emergency assistance. We got Bill Clinton to help us with fundraising for rebuilding. And we did build back better than what was there. And today, most things are either fully rebuilt or are being rebuilt as we speak. It was nature at its worst and humanity at our best. Or take Pakistan, northern Pakistan, just after the devastating earthquake. This is Kashmir. It's 3 days after the earthquake. I'm there to set up, help organize the humanitarian response, and all of the tents at this photo are relief workers flown in to help build the effort. 3.3 million people were without a roof, and we were 4 weeks away from the Himalayan winter. Now, in all previous generations, we would have said, or they did say in these kind of situations, let's see how many will survive when spring comes and we can start slowly to rebuild. They would have given up to start with. Not so now. Pakistan itself, with the donor community, with the relief agencies, with NATO, with the militaries, came to the relief of nearly everybody. There was no increase in mortality, no increase in epidemic disease, and more girls went to school that winter than in a normal year in the Kashmir. So, there is no limit to what we can do if we work together. But my seventh lesson is there seems always also to be no limit to what we can refrain from doing, because we simply do not care beyond some limited concerns in some places. So in the tsunami in the Lebanon, in the Pakistan, South Asia earthquake, we do fantastic things together. Here in Western Ivory Coast, there was no response, as there is a much too inadequate response in Eastern Congo today and in every year the last 10 years when the worst war of our generation have taken place in Eastern Congo. Why do we not have a commensurate response in the Congo or in Ivory Coast? Well, it's Africa, and it's French-speaking Africa. I mean, it doesn't seem to get the attention that it deserves. Our compassion, our international efforts seems to be a lottery. Every night, 30 different communities play in the lottery, and 1 or 2 win our attention and our resources. Now, here in West, this is the ruins of the UN headquarters of my humanitarian relief organization in Giglo, West Ivory Coast, where the thugs of the government drove away the relief workers and these people from the Burkinabe minority. And their message to me was, thank you for the food you're bringing and the relief consignments you bring. You're the first person we've seen from the international community since the atrocities several weeks earlier. But I hope you understand that when you leave, tonight the thugs will come back and they will attack us, they will rape our women, and they will steal our food, and they will probably abduct and kill some of our young men. This is exactly also what I heard here by the Darfurian refugees that I met for the first time in 2004, when we were allowed into Darfur for the first time by the Sudan government. Never would I have thought that these tens of thousands of people that had been ethnically cleansed would be there today, 4 years after, in the exact same situation, only they would be 4 times as many in need of assistance as they were at that time. Again, for me, this is like the safe areas of Bosnia all over again. We are able to organize very effective relief operations, but we're not able and willing to protect people. And there is now a responsibility to protect. It's a principle that was established in 2005. President Bush was there. My Prime Minister from Norway was there. The Russian president, the Chinese, the South African, Nigerian, they were all there. 185 global leaders, and they said, we will agree. We will promise to protect the people who are threatened by genocide, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and war crimes if they are not protected by their own authorities. But in reality, they're not upholding what they themselves solemnly swore. The 8th lesson is, in this context, something that is related to precisely that point. There is a need for political and security action, and not only humanitarian action. Here, I'm arguing with those who organize some of the Janjaweed militia in Darfur. They are not part of any effective humanitarian, effective political negotiation at the moment, and they have not met a security operation reining themselves in. Of course, at the same time, they have concerns. These are nomadic people. They say there is climate change here. There is less and less green land. It's either us or the farmers. And you only assist the farmers. Our livestock is dying. Our whole culture is dying. Our people are dying. You're only caring for them. Of course, if we look for a durable solution in Darfur, there has to be some kind of development for all of them, pastoralists and farmers. Climate change was not caused by these people. It was caused by us in the north, but they are seeing that there is less rain, more desert, more people going after less green areas. And those who really pay the price for this are these civilians, of which the women and the children are by far the most vulnerable and by far paying the biggest price. There is less wars, but there is more abuse against women, sexual violence than before. These are wars now where it's more dangerous to be a child than to be a soldier, because that's the nature of modern civil wars. It's waged against in the middle of the civilian population. Now, we can, in our time and age, use technology to go anywhere, communicate to anyone, and we can, and that's the 9th lesson, we can hold the leaders accountable like never before. Leaders for these child soldiers in northern Uganda, and especially as I'm meeting here, represented by Joseph Kony, the head of the Lord's Resistance Army. So, 9th lesson, we can hold leaders accountable if we work together. We know what is happening. We can document anything. We can see everything now with satellites and with the networks they have all over. When I went to see in the jungle of the Congo the leader of northern Ugandan Lord's Resistance Army, I showed him, as I do on the photo, documentation of each and every massacre that they were responsible for, each and every kidnapping of children that they were responsible for. And our message was, from behalf of the UN, that you will be held accountable. You will one day be brought to justice for this, but you may improve your situation if you today stop it all. And if you stop to plunder for food and rape and loot, we will give food to you and your soldiers if you sit here and stop the violence. Since then, the violence have virtually stopped. One of the worst civil wars, one of the worst conflicts of our time has come to a standstill and hopefully an end. Now, 10th and finally, I believe we can end the remaining wars and atrocity on our watch, but we can only if the right action is spearheaded by the right actors. For example, vis-à-vis Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Typical case of mismanagement, or rather of a dictator tearing apart his own country. Who have the influence in Zimbabwe? Well, Britain has tried, but it's been counterproductive. Every time Britain attacks Mugabe, he can play for the resentment against those who were behind the apartheid regime of Rhodesia, which was set up by the colonial master. It is a popular thing among black activists in southern Africa to be standing out against the West, the UK and the US. So how come it has been the West who has been spearheading the campaigns against Mugabe when it has helped Mugabe? Why wasn't it South Africa which could put pressure, effective pressure, on Mugabe, who went forward? Well, South Africa said, we cannot do it, because then we're seen as part of the Western campaign against Mugabe. We were in a vicious cycle, really. Now, South Africa is building pressure. There may be a change, but it's many years too late. It's like Darfur. The West has no effective remedies against Sudan. I believe Mr. John Prendergast spoke 1 year ago on Darfur. Well, the Bush administration in the UK did their best to change things there. They couldn't. Why? Because China and India and Malaysia and Pakistan are the biggest investors, and the Arab countries are the biggest political allies. The pressure has to be on those to change things in Sudan, as it has to be in Burma, where it's also China and the ASEAN countries. The world has changed. We have to recognize that it's a multipolar world now, but those new great powers have also to become held accountable for what they do and what they refrain from doing. Only then can we here in the Security Council get effective action, where you would say the right country has to do the right thing, not the wrong country doing the right things. Now, my concluding point is the following as we end. If my generation saw progress on so many fronts, half asleep and half-hearted, there was progress. What cannot the next generation, now in university here in Wisconsin and elsewhere, there's never been spite of financial crises now these days and in the coming months, there's never been more resources, public and private, available for the good causes. Secondly, there's never been a technology available for our operations in the fight against climate change, in the fight for development, in the fight to lift up the bottom billion and others, like now. And thirdly, there's never been better tools, whether that is the United Nations and all of its agencies, the non-governmental organizations, or the governmental organizations. There's never been more tools and better tools. So, my conclusion is, it's a question of will, of political will, for now this generation to fulfill the dream of a world without the kind of abject poverty and of medieval wars that we're still seeing too much of in our generation. Thank you very much.